Hey everyone, Chelsea here from A Frugal Homestead. Today we are sharing a recipe with you for our Lemon Blueberry Buttermilk Scones. They are one of our family favorites, and this recipe does take a little bit more time than most, but it's still pretty quick. So I'm just setting up my KitchenAid here so that I can grate my butter. Now the key to this recipe is ensuring that all of your ingredients are cold. So I'm starting out with frozen butter, and I'm going to grate a half a cup of butter. So 1 stick of butter. And I'm just grating it with my KitchenAid. You can use a regular kitchen grater, that works just as well. But your butter will start warming up a little bit faster than it does in my KitchenAid, and that's fine. But again, you want to keep it as cold as possible. So I start with frozen butter. I grate all of that, and then I'm going to put the grated butter back into my freezer when it's all done so that it stays nice and cold. And the reason behind that is that helps the dough keep its shape. It also helps to keep the dough really fluffy and light, because once that butter melts, it doesn't create the pockets of air that the fat will leave behind when it melts. So if you really want a really fluffy and light scone, you want your butter to stay cold for as long as possible. So this portion takes a little bit longer, but I always do the butter first so that it can get in the freezer and stay cool. So I'm just going to clean this out here, and then we're going to pop this into the freezer, and then we can move on to the next step. So next I'm going to take my lemon and I'm going to zest my lemon. You need about a tablespoon of lemon zest, give or take, just depending on how much lemon flavor that you want. I'm going to use about a tablespoon, and I just zest it first so it's done. And then I'll just set it aside here. Next we're going to combine our dry ingredients. So we have 2 cups of flour that we're putting in here. And then we're going to add a half a cup of sugar. And then we're going to add our leavening agents. And we're going to use both baking powder and baking soda in this recipe. Now, quick breads can vary on whether they use baking soda or baking powder. But when you use them both, you're getting that double reaction and just a little bit more. Which is what you want to help these scones to raise. So we're using 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, and then a half a teaspoon of salt. And then I just mix that all together so it's nice and combined. All right, the next step is I'm adding my lemon zest. I'm just going to mix it in just like it's one of the other dry ingredients. I love lemon zest in this with the blueberries. Okay, finally I've taken my butter out of the freezer and I'm adding it to my dry ingredients here, and you just see I'm using my whisk to mix it in and coat that butter, and that's going to help it stick so that all the butter doesn't clump into one section once it's coated with that flour. So that's kind of an important step. Now then you kind of want to work quickly so your butter doesn't melt. But the next thing you're going to do is add your buttermilk. So I've got my measuring cup here. I'm using 1 cup of buttermilk. This is fresh buttermilk that we have left over from the homemade yogurt that we make. And homemade yogurt is so good. But this buttermilk is absolutely delicious, so it's super fun. All right, and then I'm just taking a spatula, and I'm just going to kind of mix that dough until it clumps up into a ball. We don't want to overwork the dough because that will melt the butter, but we want to work it enough that it's going to form a ball so that we can handle it. And then I'm going to use my hand, and just inside the bowl, I'm going to kind of shape it into that ball by kneading it a few times. Okay, again, I don't want to over knead it because that's going to melt the butter and make it a really tough scone, and I don't want tough scones. And this can get really messy because it can get really sticky when you're combining flour with anything, right? It kind of makes a glue because it's forming that gluten. So if you have to add a little bit more flour just to keep it from sticking to everything, that's just fine. That's totally normal. But I found that just keeping it in the bowl helps to keep my counter from getting too crazy. And once it's kind of shaped into a little bit of more of a solid ball, then I'll put it on my countertop with a little bit of flour, and then I can knead a little bit more or roll it out like it needs to be. All right, my dough is ready, and now I'm going to roll it out on my countertop into a 12-inch by 12-inch square. This square is going to help me so that I can incorporate the butter as much as I can. So this recipe is kind of like, or at least this portion of the recipe is kind of like when you make croissants. You're creating kind of layers of butter and layers of dough, and that's what makes it tender and flaky. So we've rolled it out into kind of a 12 by 12-inch square, and then we fold it in half, kind of like a letter, and then we're going to fold it in half again, both sides meeting in the middle, so it's kind of like this little bundle, this little square bundle, almost like it's back in the ball shape. I'm going to put this back in the refrigerator for another 5 to 10 minutes to help that butter to settle and cool down, and then I'm going to bring it back out, flour my surface here. I'm going to roll that little dough back out into my square. So I'm going to grab my rolling pin here. I just don't want it to stick, so try it because it's going to get really sticky. You can see that there. So I'm going to add lots of flour here. It gets really sticky after coming out of the refrigerator and everything kind of settles again. And so it can get a little bit messy. But I'm just going to use my hands and kind of shape it into that square. And that's fine. Use your hands, use what you need. Try not to overhandle it, but it's a quick bread, so it's pretty forgiving. That's what I like about this recipe. Now I am using freeze-dried blueberries as my topping. I'm not reconstituting that at all. I'm literally just setting them on my dough. You can use freeze-dried food. You could use frozen blueberries or strawberries. You could use fresh blueberries. It honestly doesn't really matter for this recipe. I found they all work. And then I'm going to fold again my dough like it's a letter. So folding the top down and folding the bottom up. And then I'm going to kind of pinch and smush that seam together so that it stays together. Now I'm going to kind of spread it out a little bit. I want it to be pretty even to make all of the scones. So I'm going to take a knife and cut it in the middle. So I have 2 sections, and then I'm going to cut those 2 sections into 4 sections. And then I'm just taking my knife and I'm going to cut those 4 sections in half diagonally. So I have 8 pieces of my scone now. Now I have in the past actually cut those triangles again in half to make kind of these little mini scones, because sometimes a whole scone for one of my kids can be a lot. So that's another option. And then I'm going to just take those pieces and I'm going to place them on a baking sheet with parchment paper. The parchment paper is going to help keep your sheet clean for one, but it's also going to help make sure that those scones brown up really nicely and don't stick to your pan, which is always very nice. And then finally, I'm going to brush each scone with some butter, give it a little bit more flavor, and then I'm going to sprinkle sugar on each scone. This is actually a really important step. It adds a lot of flavor, this little bit of sugar you're sprinkling. Then I'm going to put them in a 425 oven for about 16 to 18 minutes. And this is what they look like when they are all done. So, so delicious.